Welcome to the Library Podcast. My name's Kim. In this episode, we will be discussing the English author Nancy Mitford. Born in 1904 in London, England, Nancy was the eldest of the Mitford children. With 5 sisters and 1 brother, Nancy had plenty of inspiration to pull from her own family when starting her writing career. In total, Nancy Mitford wrote 8 novels and 4 biographies on historical figures. Anne-Marie and Fred joined the podcast to discuss Nancy Mitford and her work. I thought we'd start with maybe Fred telling us about how you first encountered Nancy Mitford and what spoke to you about her writing.
Well, I was backpacking through Europe with my then partner David, and we would always go to the English section of a bookstore in whatever city we were in to get something to read. There were always old penguins. And I think it was in Florence. David found Love in a Cold Climate. Love in a Cold Climate, not The Pursuit of Love, the second in that series. And he read it first because he'd picked it out. And he was laughing hysterically. And I was like, what? What's so funny? And I pounced on it as soon as he was finished. And I was hooked. And I couldn't wait to get to the first of the series, Pursuit of Love. But we couldn't find it in any of the bookstores subsequently. So it was several months before we got back to Canada. And I was able to follow through with that. And her writing was it was so funny. It was basically a little social history of a period that I was very attracted to, sort of England between the wars. And it really spoke to me. And from Nancy, I think I had already known about her sister, Jessica Mitford, who wrote an amazing book called The American Way of Death, a real spoof of the funeral, but also an expose of the funeral industry in America. It was published in the early 60s. From there I just pursued all of the sisters. Most of them were writers, actually. Diana Mitford, the famous fascist, and the last one, who was the Duchess of Devonshire, Deborah Mitford. She also wrote a memoir called Wait for Me, which was great fun. She was an Elvis fan, and she knew John F. Kennedy. So there.
Anne-Marie, what was your first encounter with the Mitfords and their legend and their writing?
I would say from Fred. To be honest, I was not aware of Nancy Mitford or her sisters. I understand now there's a television series, but I haven't watched that either. So I learned about it through Fred.
I'd heard of Nancy Mitford and the Mitford sisters, but I hadn't actually picked up and read Nancy Mitford until now, because I was like, finally encouraged to. Fred, what is it about her style that you think makes her stand out from the other Mitford sisters?
She's such a sort of snide wit, and sometimes, she can be very cutting, but in a very polite way. She's very witty, but a little bit devious, and I think that is what attracted me to her writing. I have not read Diana Mitford's work, so I can't speak to that. But I would say her sister Jessica has her own snide way of writing, but they're at cross purposes, I'd say.
Anne-Marie, what did you think of Nancy Mitford's writing style, and which books did you read?
Yeah, so I read The Pursuit of Love first, which I think was the right kind of quote-unquote order. And then I read Love in a Cold Climate after that. And, well, first I'll speak to, her style. I was very envious of her style because she seems to be one of those writers who it appears to be effortless. Yes. Like I can almost picture her at a desk just giggling to herself, writing things, not going back and editing. It's I feel like it's almost perfect the first time she writes it. And I will say it's really hard to write comedy in a novel where the reader actually laughs out loud, because it can come off as either silly, or it can come off as just too light. But with hers, there was always this depth to her comedy too, and I guess there's the satire. But I cared about. Now I will. Okay, so in The Pursuit of Love, I did care a lot about a lot of the characters, especially Fanny, the narrator. I wanted to know more about her, and then Fred, you mentioned to me, "Oh, read Love in a Cold Climate, and you'll learn more about Fanny's," because she kept saying in The Pursuit of Love, well, enough about me, and I'm like, no, I want to know more about you. And then, but I really cared. And then Love in a Cold Climate, there unfortunately were a lot of unlikable characters in that one. So I was maybe a little triggered. I don't know, especially by like Lady Montor and Boy. Like I couldn't. I thought that Fanny and Nancy Mitford, in a way, was being very sort of forgiving of them, but not even forgiving, because it's not like she came out and just said, "Oh, I forgive you for being such a narcissist." But I just felt like she gave them way too much grace. Like I just didn't. Where in The Pursuit of Love, even though Linda made a lot of decisions I didn't agree with, especially as a mother and how she treated her daughter, that was really hard for me. But I know it was a different time, but I cared about Linda. But I had a harder time in Love in a Cold Climate. So that yeah. But I appreciated the humor in both. But I actually laughed more in The Pursuit of Love because I think I found it more endearing, where there were only like a few spots in Love in a Cold Climate where I actually laughed out loud. So I don't know if you guys felt the same way. I don't know, what did you read, Kim?
I read The Blessing.
Oh,
So I read, it's a bit later, and it's when she's in France. And I think what I would say that maybe relates to your comment about, because I haven't read those two books, so I have to go back. But she'll just state things that are it's interesting how quickly she can move a narrative by just stating things. Sometimes she doesn't linger on them, and they're big plot points. Yes. But I actually really enjoy that. Yes. And she is very matter of fact about some things. Yes. And she's not necessarily giving any judgment to it. Yes. It's just, this is how it is. Yes. And it was interesting because it leaves you with a lot to think about, at least in The Blessing, especially about relationships and marriage. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Well, I mean, Nancy was a real Francophile. She moved to France at the end of the 40s, I think. And she was in love with this man, Gaston, I can't pronounce his last name. He was Polish, but actually he worked for General de Gaulle. And they were lovers at first, but then they were just good friends, although she never really gave up her crush on him. And he was the basis for the Duc de Sauveterre from Love in a Cold Climate. And later in life, he kind of broke her heart by marrying somebody else. And so she decided to blow up the relationship of Linda and the Duc de Sauveterre in one of her last books on those people, called Don't Tell Alfred. It's about Fanny again, and she's talking to Val Hubert from The Blessing, and they talk about the cousin Linda, and he says, he hid her in Paris for months, and nobody had any idea of it. That was the Duc de Sauveterre, and he said, yes, and the war had only just begun, and it didn't seem serious then. Also, I think Fabrice had somebody else. So she just explodes their love affair by basically saying he was two-timing her. And just very cold, but moves on from there. I can't remember what I was trying to bring this around to. But anyway, Nancy loved France and was living in France, but at first did encounter, I guess, some of the strangeness of being an Englishwoman in France. Later, though, she wrote several biographies of famous French people like Madame de Pompadour and the Sun King, and I think she was working on Voltaire in her final illness when she died. I think it was published just before she died. I don't know if that helps.
Well, do you have a favorite of her novels, Fred? Because it sounds like, have you read all of them?
Yeah. You know what? I haven't read. She had two very early ones. She wrote initially to make money because even though she came from a family of aristocrats, they were not wealthy. She didn't have a big allowance, and so her first ones, Christmas Pudding and Highland Fling, were they're light. They're not nearly as accomplished, I'd say, as the later ones, but still quite fun. Then she wrote a satire on fascism called Wigs on the Green, where she was very much spoofing one of her sisters and Oswald Mosley, the infamous British Union of Fascists leader. So that I've never found. She also wrote one called Pigeon Pie, and it was just at the beginning of World War II, and she was kind of making fun. This was before the Blitz of London, and it sort of sank without a trace because it wasn't right for the time. And I encountered that once, and I don't know where that copy's gone. So I can't remember it very well. There's two I haven't read, yeah.
What do you think about how the Mitford sister legend maybe keeps her work in people's consciousness? Because it seems like, especially from what I stand, maybe even in England a bit more, they sort of think of these eccentric sisters, like they're the Spice Girls, and except naughty politically. Do you think that helps her or maybe hinders her because people have preconceived notions?
Oh, well, I mean, yeah, I think it probably helps on the whole. There's a wonderful book written about all of the sisters by Mary Lovell, called The Sisters. So I recommend that to anyone who wants to get a feel for what Nancy and all of them were all about. But I think overall, no, I think it helps. Her books are fairly autobiographical. I mean, certainly actually all of the novels. So you get a sense of her life. And some people felt that later on, Jessica, the younger sister, wrote about her life as seen through Nancy's books. She was writing about some of the incidents that Nancy had written about as if they'd really happened when they were slightly fictionalized. It's interesting. No, I think it helps, and they're fascinating.
Yeah, I think it helps too, and there's something to be said about writing a book of the times. Like, I think about books, I love learning about history through novels. I wish I had paid more attention in school because I don't have very good knowledge of history, but this is how I enjoy learning about it through the eyes of a character who actually experienced it. And there's something to be said for reading about this time, like you said, between the wars, from an author who was writing around that time. Like, I guess it was just after World War II, but it was so recent. And think of all the authors now who write about that time or the wartime who weren't there, who didn't live there. And especially as a woman, we come with all these preconceived ideas about what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a mother. And as I commented earlier, I was horrified as a mother. I couldn't imagine allowing my child to live with the father and the stepmom and just go off to another country. Like, the pain, the agony that I would feel. So, but I understand it was a different time. And so I appreciate learning it this way rather than from an author who is studying and maybe even talking to people at that time. But really, genuinely, as a writer, you can't really know what it was like. You can imagine it, and you can try your best to write about that time and what it meant, especially, I'm going to say, because this is almost always from a female perspective for Nancy Mitford, that I think that there's something so genuine about that. So that's why I think it helps her, because it's like a window into what it really meant to be a woman at that time.
Yeah, Nancy couldn't have children. She had had a lot of miscarriages, and I think that top. Anyway, she had problems, and I think that informed the writing that you're talking about. She didn't despise children, but she couldn't have any of her own, so she wasn't going to give Linda one. I think that was it. Yeah.
Interesting. Yes. Well, even I noticed in Love in a Cold Climate, when people would come over to Fanny's house, she would, like, the children would be sent away. Okay, Mommy wants to have time with her friends now. Off you go. And I was like,
Who would you recommend Nancy Mitford to read? If you saw their reading tastes, maybe like, oh, if you like this author, this style of writing, you should really check out Nancy Mitford.
Oh, I'm stumped by that, because I would recommend her to absolutely every woman I know. Maybe not every man I know. She's a little too female in some ways. Every gay man I know, though, because of Cedric and Love in a Cold Climate. He's a wonderful character, and a Canadian character. Yeah, I think everyone. And I can't think any specifically of who's been inspired by her, because I think she's unique, really quite unique.
I would have to agree, because even though the time period of what she's writing about, it's the way she writes about it, that wit. To be honest, I've never come across another writer who could make me laugh out loud like this, and as I mentioned earlier, like also care so much. What about you, Kim? Can you think of?
Well, I think if someone loved Brideshead Revisited,
Right, even like that.
yeah, and they hadn't read Nancy Mitford, then to recommend. But modern novels, I find it a bit harder to think about. I almost feel like if you really enjoy punchy nonfiction, that maybe you would really enjoy it because of the way they move. And I can't think of many modern novels like from the last 5 years who have that sort of, she's almost like a friend gossiping with you.
Yes,
So
very much so.
if you enjoy that, you'll really enjoy the books.
Yes.
Do you have anything you'd like to read from one of her books?
Oh,
Fred?
Well, I wanted to just, there's something that she's associated with, and it was a book of essays called Noblesse Oblige. Now, she only edited it, and she wrote a piece in it, but the famous bit in this is called You and Non-You, and it's all about how do upper class people speak as compared to the proletariat. So this might be strange to you, but serviette would be non-you. That's what the proletariat would say. Table napkin would be you. Other things like passed on is non-you, died is you. Sometimes it's the more sort of just plain speaking that is the upper class way of speaking. Jam instead of preserve. And the one that's the other way around, though, is mirror is non-you, whereas if you're you, you say looking glass, which I think is quite interesting. So, yeah, I just thought I'd mention that. Rather than reading from it, just a few as opposed to, is non-you, as opposed to a hall or dining room. There you go.
That's a good note to end on. Thanks so much to Anne-Marie and Fred for joining me to discuss the fascinating work and life of Nancy Mitford. Now, Anne-Marie will read an excerpt from the Walsh Sisters Part 1, a non-fiction piece written by Mary Kristiansen. Mary is an avid fan of the To the Library podcast and also happens to be Anne-Marie's mother.
There were 4 Walsh sisters and 1 brother who survived childhood in the 1890s in London, England. The eldest sister was christened Ellen, born in October of 1890, and of all the sisters, lived the most storied, ambitious life. Joseph Walsh, her father, was listed in the 1911 census as working in a gas plant in London, England. The family needed a lodger to pay expenses, as one was registered living at the address. It was not the wealthiest of neighborhoods in which to live. However, Joseph Walsh was gifted with musical talent and could play a number of instruments. He led a band which evidently was popular in higher society households. Ellen had inherited her father's musical talent and possessed a very rich singing voice. In her teens, she often sang in her father's band. It is said that a wealthy family were so impressed with her talent that they paid for Ellen to receive professional vocal training. After her father's death in 1913, Ellen Walsh transformed into Eleonora de Rohan and began to give choral concerts, which drew appreciative listeners. Eleonora was very observant, and her accent became similar to that of her wealthy patrons, as did her tastes in food and behavior. An Irish doctor, Gerald Brady, who had a successful large practice in London, became an ardent patron of Eleonora de Rohan's concerts. He was single, 12 years older, and smitten with Eleonora. He had a grand house in West Ham and at least 2 maids working for him. In 1920, Eleonora married Gerald, and they had 2 children together, Catherine, born in 1922, and Gerald, born in 1926. When her children were young, Eleonora made friends with women living in similar well-to-do circumstances and enjoyed her life. She learned to speak French and German fluently, and in the years between the wars visited the European continent with her friends, Sans children, even cruising along the Rhine. Eleonora was an accomplished pianist who could accompany herself when she sang. She had a keen ear for music, so she could play any tune if it were sung to her. Eleonora used this gift as a way to charm guests at parties. At one point, Eleonora became bored with her life in West Ham and prevailed upon her husband to buy her a flat in Hampstead, a very fashionable, affluent neighborhood in London. She would go off to live there among her friends when she wanted to be free of cares. Eleonora made little time for her 2 young children, persuading her unmarried youngest sister to move into the West Ham house to help her care for them in her stead.
Thank you, Mary, for that wonderful excerpt from your work. And thank you to Anne-Marie for that beautiful reading. We once again find ourselves at the end of the To the Library podcast. Books mentioned in this episode include The Pursuit of Love, Love in a Cold Climate, The Blessing, Wigs on the Green, Christmas Pudding, and Highland Fling, all written by Nancy Mitford. To the Library podcast is produced by the Marire and Lake Public Library. I hope this episode inspired you to pick up a novel by Nancy Mitford. Until next time, keep reading.